welcome back to our Wisdom Literature video devotional series. And whether you are a Bible nerd like me or you are just getting started on this adventure of following Jesus, I am super glad that you are here. Last time what we did, we took a look through Scripture and just traced some key points at which we find wisdom itself in the story of Scripture so that we could trace it all the way from beginning to end. And today what we are going to do is we're going to take a look at what wisdom literature is and where it fits in the context of Hebrew scriptures as a whole. So to get us started, I want to go over some very basic elementary information. So for those of you that may be in Bible college, or even if you're not, I'm about to give you a nugget that is going to be useful for the studying of scriptures regardless. This is some fairly basic information that you might find in an introduction to the Old Testament class. The Hebrew scriptures, what we refer to as the Old Testament, has a different canon for Jews today. And that canon is referred to as the Tanakh. Oftentimes you may see it with a capital T, lowercase a, capital N, lowercase a, capital K. And the reason for that is because it is the Hebrew canon of scripture. So think if you were Jewish, this is what you would read. You would read the Tanakh. And it consists of three parts. The Torah, which is often referred to as the law, and that's the first 5 books in the Bible. We refer to it as the Pentateuch as well. The Nevi'im, which is where the N in Tanakh comes from, and that stands for the prophets. Ketuvim means writings. So, with all that being said, the Hebrews have a different canon. It comes in a different order than what we have. The Torah is just the first 5 books, and then we as Christians tend to refer to the next parts as the historical books. But in all reality, all of those books after the Torah, after the Pentateuch, are written through a prophetic perspective. And so that's why they're called the prophets. You got the law, the prophets, and the writings. And with the writings, that we have poetry, wisdom literature, that's where we're going to be studying, various other forms of literature as well. I mean, you've got immensely creative stories in the writings. As you read it, you think this is not just a matter of documenting history, this is a matter of getting some other point across by having different forms of literature. We find that in the prophets as well, that the whole point of it is not just to write facts down, it's to write history in a way that proves a point. The writers are intentional about connecting the scriptures, about having hyperlinks to other parts of the scriptures in the prophets in order to prove a point, in order to give some deeper meaning and a deeper insight into what God is trying to communicate to us through these writings, through the law, the prophets, and the writings. That's oftentimes why you would see Jesus referred to, let's say in the New Testament, in the Gospels, he says the law and the prophets. Why does he say that? He's referring directly to the Tanakh. And anytime that you see the law, is it the writer or the speaker in the New Testament that is referring to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible? Are they referring to the Tanakh as a whole, the entirety of the Hebrew scriptures? Or are they referring to the 613 commands? That is something that may change based off of the author and the person speaking and how they are using those reference in that context in order to be referring to one of those 3 things whenever you see the law. I personally prefer to read through the Hebrew scriptures as a Hebrew would. I very much so prefer to look at it through the canon of the Tanakh as opposed to our modern Bibles. Let's say in our New International Version or our New American Standard Bible, we have it laid out in a certain way. And I'm not anti the canon of scripture. Hear me out here. I just like the Hebrew canon because the way that it is set up provides a certain insight into the scriptures that you might not otherwise find. We find bookends in the end of Deuteronomy and in the beginning of Joshua. We find it also in the end of Malachi and in the beginning of Psalms, because Psalms is the beginning part of the Ketuvim. It is not part of the Nevi'im. So the placement at which we find the books in the Bible are different than they would be in the Tanakh. Another bookend is at the very end. Chronicles sits at the Tanakh. Chronicles is a historical account. Chronicles is like, hey, let's look at everything that's happened so far, sum it up from beginning to end, and at the very end of Chronicles we see another bookend that ends the Tanakh, that ends the Hebrew scriptures, and sets us up to look forward to when God is going to fulfill his promises. All that being said, where is the wisdom literature? It is in the writings. The writings are fascinating to me because there are multiple different types of literature. There's creative writing, there's poetry, there's wisdom literature. Creative writing, I think of stories like Ruth and Esther, which are in no way boring, but are written in such a riveting way that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Something I love about the wisdom literature specifically is that wisdom literature is something that isn't new, nor was it new at that point in time, to a civilization. There are multiple civilizations and cultures throughout history that have had wisdom literature. For example, there are proverbial sayings in all kinds of different cultures. In Japan, in ancient China, in ancient Egypt, in Rome. I think of writings like The Art of War by Sun Tzu, or Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. In fact, I'm reading through Meditations by Marcus Aurelius right now. He's got a lot of wisdom to offer. So there's wisdom literature in multiple cultures. So what we find in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job is God's provision to his people so that they could also have wisdom literature. And what did that help people do in the midst of their cultures? Wisdom literature existed to help people live well. It was a way of figuring out how to navigate the world. And so what we find is that the wisdom literature that God has provided for us is a perspective, is a way that we can read and learn and develop so that we can learn how to live well in the midst of this world that God has given us. Here is what is fascinating about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. While they are God's provision to us to learn how to live well in the midst of the world that he gave us, they happen in a specific order that where one kind of layers on top of the other. For example, Proverbs. Proverbs is God's provision to us to show what it would look like to live well in the midst of a world that is operating as it should. Like I said in the previous videos, they give us promises that if we do things a certain way, that things will turn out in our favor, that if we're righteous, that God will look at us a certain way and that he will deliver us, that he delivers the humble, that he justifies and he vindicates and he rights every wrong. Proverbs is what life would look like in an ideal world that still somehow has evil in it, but where if it's a battle between evil and good, that good comes out victorious 100% of the time. That is if you have an only Proverbs perspective. But what we find is that even though it is true, that it is not always true. So Proverbs are truth proven through experience. They are not truth in and of themselves. It's different than when I say, God is the creator of the universe. That is a truth, point blank, that is a fact. When I say, teach your kid in the way he should go, and if he goes astray, then he'll come back to that later on in life, that is something that may be true 90% of the time, but there is that 10% of the time when they go off and they do their own thing, and there ain't no way that they're going to return to the way that you raised them up in. So Proverbs has a way of, if we look at it like that, if we look at things in black and white as right and wrong, and that's it, Proverbs has a way of getting us pretty upset. But what happens is Ecclesiastes comes into the picture and layers on top of that. It gives us assurance, which is a funny word for Ecclesiastes, that things don't always work out the way that we planned. It gives us assurance that there are three things coming for everybody, and that is time, chance, and death. So you may start out thinking, I happen to the universe. But then what Ecclesiastes shows us is that the universe happens to us. That sometimes, despite everything that we've done, whether we've done the right thing or the wrong thing, no matter what, the end result could be something completely unpredictable. We could walk out into the street and get hit by a bus. You never know when that problem is going to present. The relationship between Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job follows a certain pattern that we also see all the way throughout Scripture. And it's a pattern that we find in the context of story. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, just that order of things reveals to us a certain story and a certain way that God likes to do things. Oftentimes it can be equated with three words: promise, problem, and provision. So we find it, for example, in the story of Abraham. We find it in the story of Joseph. We find it all over Scripture. There starts with a promise from God, and then there's a problem, and then there's provision. Maybe you have a promise given by God that you can live a good life, a healthy life, a whole life, that you can have a beautiful family that is very loving to one another. And then there's the problem. There's the backbiting, the betrayal. There's the spouse that leaves you. There's the spouse that dies, the children that die, the cancer diagnosis. There's so many things that present as a problem in the midst. And we think, God, how could this happen? I thought that you had big plans for me. I thought that you had a future and a hope for me. And the next thing you know, this problem happens. But then there's provision. And this is the beautiful thing about the story of Job. What it shows is the story of a guy who starts off as a Proverbs man. He's righteous, he worships God, he is a good person to the core of him. He ends up with lots of wealth, with a family, with friends. He's very well renowned and respected. And then the problem happens. He gets sick, his children die, his wife leaves him. And then his friends, they come along, and what we start to see is that Job, who was a Proverbs man, has become an Ecclesiastes man. And his friends are still lagging behind. They're still Proverbs people. And they come along, and what we see is this interaction between the righteous justification of Proverbs and the reality of tragedy that we find in Ecclesiastes. And we see this debate between the two of those categories, very beautifully written and poetically written. And then eventually, what we find is provision. What we see is this conversation between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, between the promise and the problem. And then the provision steps in, and that provision is God. And God comes in and he says, what doesn't matter is how you happen to the universe, and what doesn't matter is how the universe happens to you. What matters is that I exist. It shows us that God is here, that he is aware, that he is paying attention, that he cares for us, and he loves us. So wisdom literature in and of itself follows this beautiful story of promise, problem, and provision. And at the end of it all, we get to walk away with some hope, knowing that God exists, and he is above us, and that he is a good God, and he is worthy of our worship, and he sees us, he's paying attention, and he loves us. So with that being said, I hope that you can walk away encouraged today and know that life is not as simple as a Proverbs life. It is not as depressing as an Ecclesiastes life, and that there is provision. Despite your problem, you have been given a promise, and there is provision coming your way. I truly believe that, and even if it doesn't come until Jesus comes back to the earth, it is coming. So next time, we'll start digging into Ecclesiastes itself. We will take a look at its historical context, its literary devices, its overall structure, and we will start digging in. Love you guys, and we'll see you next time. Bye.